Welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. I'm John, Father John Deere, and today I'm speaking with my friend, the spiritual writer and theologian, Father Ron Rolheiser. This is a project of beatitudecenter.org, where you can find many other podcasts and regular Zoom programs on the nonviolence of Jesus, practicing nonviolence, and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. So let's begin with a little prayer, as usual. I invite you just to take a deep breath wherever you are and relax and recenter yourself. And together, let's enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely and personally and everyone everywhere. And we welcome the nonviolent Jesus here with us and ask for the grace to follow the nonviolent Jesus more faithfully and do God's will. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life, love, and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect together on your call to follow the nonviolent Jesus and work for a more nonviolent, more just world. Bless us, inspire us, disarm us, strengthen us, and send us out to do your will, to do our part to help end poverty, racism, greed, injustice, war, nuclear weapons, fascism, environmental destruction, that we might be your beatitude people, your holy peacemakers, and welcome your reign of universal love, nonviolence, and peace on earth. In Jesus' name, amen. It's a great blessing to welcome here my friend, writer, and theologian, Father Ron Rolheiser, who's one of the most popular Catholic writers in the world, and I'm hoping he'll tell us about his new book, Insane for the Light, A Spirituality for Our Wisdom Years, which is the conclusion of his trilogy of great bestsellers. So I'll ask him about that. He is the author of many books, including The Restless Heart, The Shattered Lantern, Forgotten Among the Lilies, and The Passion and the Cross. And for those new to Father Ron, you might like to get the Orbis book anthology called Ron Rolheiser, Essential Spiritual Writings. He recently retired from his position as president of the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas, which I think is one of the best schools in the country. And you can learn more about him at his website, www.ronrolheiser.com. Father Ron, welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast.
Thank you for having me, John.
So your new book is the conclusion of your trilogy of the two great books, The Holy Longing and Sacred Fire. So why don't you bring us up to speed, tell us a little bit about those two big bestsellers so that we can then get to the new book.
Well, John, they set it up. In my spiritual writings, actually, I based the structure on the great mystic John of the Cross, who said we have three phases of our life. The first phase is to get our life together, from the time, we're born, especially from puberty and into our 20s. So the Holy Longing is a book on how do you get your life together as a Christian, okay? But then the second phase of our life is how do you give your life away? So sometime in your 20s or 30s, you mature, and then the next 30 or 40 years of your life, the agenda is no longer you. The agenda is how do you now give your life away? That is sacred fire. But then, and this is spiritual we need to develop, but, imagine people retire at 65 or something. You're going to live another 25 years. What are those years for? And thereafter expression, it's to give your death away. So struggle to give your life away, holy longing. Struggle to get your life together, holy longing. Struggle to give your life away, sacred fire. Struggle to die properly, to leave a proper spirit behind, and that your later years are actually generative years, but in a different way. That's the conclusion of the trilogy, Insane for the Light.
Why did you call it Insane for the Light?
Well, I took if you look, The Holy Longing, that's the title of a poem from Goethe, the German. But in there, he says, you can reach a point in your life, he said, where you desire a higher lovemaking, you become insane for the light. And I opened with an image. I'm sure your people know about Rachel Raymond, the wonderful writer, Kitchen Table Wisdom. But she tells a story. She said, as a young girl, she used to candy stripe on a Saturday, where you go, you try to help older people, play nurse. So one Saturday, she was assigned to this old woman who wouldn't even acknowledge her existence. This woman just sat and looked out the window for the entire hour. And then as she's leaving, she said, I'm leaving. The woman turned to her and she had a strange look on her face. And Rachel said to her, what are you looking at? Said, dear, he said, I was staring at the light. He said, I never saw that face again. She became a gynecologist. The first time I delivered a baby, when it comes out of the womb, that's the expression on its face. This woman was looking towards the next life. So those two metaphors together, insane for the light. Plus, you have to admit it's a catchy title.
And so is your subtitle, A Spirituality for Our Wisdom Years. What would be some of the benchmarks of that? Tell us about that.
Well, I think we'll talk about it later. One of the benchmarks is passivity.
What do you call it?
Passivity, which is the different kind of generativity. So, for instance, John, right now, you and I, we're still in our generative years. We're doing things. There's going to come a time we're in a wheelchair or whatever. We're not doing things anymore. So how does our life generative then? What are we giving off? But then also, like in the book, I talk about it's the call to, or sometimes I ask this question. I ask it to myself mostly: who am I when I stop doing? Who am I when I stop doing? I'm still struggling with that. I'm a doer. So in your retirement years and so on, you become suddenly you stop. Who are you, and how do you give your spirit and life and generativity now, when you're no longer paying the mortgage, doing the rent, raising the kids and doing all this stuff for doing ministry? Who are we when this all stops?
It's a great question. I mean, it is the question, isn't who are we? What does it mean to be alive, to be human? And one of the themes, I think, of your book, from what I've read online, is as we grow older, one thing you say is we can all turn to bitterness. I'm sure of that. But if we are seekers of wisdom, we can turn to forgiveness, right, to deeper faith, to, you call it, a new virtuous hope, and ultimately from control to surrender. And I was amazed about that because my new book, my last few years I've been reflecting on, it's called Universal Love, but surrendering to God. And I just had Joyce Rupp on this podcast, and she has a new book on surrendering to God called The Years of Ripening. So tell me about these themes, especially moving from control to surrender. To me, that's very helpful.
Let's take the one first. It's control to surrender, and not just surrendering to God, just surrendering. Richard Rohr has a line very much like Richard Rohr says, you can put all the gospel challenge into one long word: surrender. Give it over.
Really? Wow.
And Henry Nouwen talks, I use Henry Nouwen as a paradigm. He was this highly successful, sought after, over popular, man, and his whole life he said, nobody loves me. People loved him. He couldn't receive it. Then he had an out of death experience in a car accident. And afterwards he said, I'm loved. That's when he wrote his great books, the Return of the Prodigal Son, The Life That He Beloved. He said, but all the years when he was so loved, he couldn't receive it. And that's our deep struggle. That is our deep struggle. And Richard said, you surrender to love. The biblical thing is, that is Jacob wrestling with the angel, who he eventually has to surrender after the angel wounds him. Or I used the example, interesting in Scripture, at the Last Supper, when Jesus gets up to wash the disciples' feet, he comes to Peter, and Peter said, no, no, no. The irony is, more than anything else, Peter wanted to be touched in that way. And when it's offered, he couldn't take it. That's us. And when Richard Rohr says surrender, he means not just surrendering to God, but just we surrender his life. And, the other words I use in there that come up then, surrender, you surrender to gratitude as opposed to bitterness. It is so easy to age into bitterness. Or I shouldn't even say age into bitterness. John, I was once at a psychiatric conference, and somebody asked, this very good psychiatrist, said, why do so many people get bitter when they get old and angry? And he laughed and he said, it never happens. 40 years of psychiatry, I've never seen it. He said, I think what you're talking about is an angry person getting old. See, the anger has always been there, and see, part of the program, it seems like we have to address this and let it go. That, the anger has to turn to softness, which turns into gratitude and then turns into forgiveness.
Beautiful.
And again, like Richard Rohr says, surrender, I say, as you age, you only need to have 2 words in your spiritual vocabulary: gratitude and forgiveness. Gratitude and forgiveness.
I found another great quote of Richard's where he says, everyone thinks it's something like this: the spiritual life is about getting everything under control, like God. And the spiritual life, he writes, is the exact opposite, letting go of all control so that God is in total control. And you brought up our friend Henry now, and I think I told you that the only time I heard him speak in 1985, it's to 1,000 of us. We were about to be arrested the next day. It was Peace Pentecost, and he gave a 2-hour talk, and we were I've still never heard anybody talk like that to this day. We're sitting on the edge of our chairs, and one of his themes was the theme of your book here. He said, and he was trying to get at us, you're not an activist. So he's speaking to activists. You think your whole life is being an activist and a doer. Your life is you're the beloved of God. And if you're a Christian, you're following Jesus. And then he goes, so let's look at Jesus. And I want you to comment on this. This is what Henry said. I never thought about this before. The whole of Jesus' life is action, action, action. If you study the verbs, Henry said, they're active verbs. He taught, he walked, he got up, he healed, he touched. And then it all changes and the verbs become passive verbs. He was arrested, he was betrayed, he was denied, he was dragged away, he was tortured, he was killed, he died. And Henry said, that's the journey. And it's a journey from action to passivity, but it's actually a journey deeper into love and peace and surrender and God, and it's okay because we're the beloved. That's what you're getting at here, right? And what you wrote about.
John, you just put it perfectly well. I'll add this to it. It's not just, but also in that you're giving off something that's more powerful than your activity. One of the things, like with Jesus, like Henry's right. If you take the Gospels, up until Jesus is arrested, all the active verbs are active. He walked, he taught, and so on. See, then afterwards, all the verbs become passive. But it's interesting to say we're saved more by his death than by his life. So we're saved more by what he couldn't do than all the things he did. See, so your helplessness, you're going to prison and so on, that is a very generative act.
But as you're saying, he went deeper into surrender, love, nonviolence, forgiving people who are killing him. I mean, that's practically impossible. And so he's been practicing that his whole life. You could argue, couldn't you, that, and Henry wrote a whole beautiful book on befriending death and giving your life away, that Jesus looks passive, but actually he's the strongest, most active person because he's forgiving. I mean, it's the ultimate living forgiveness, and into your hands I commit my spirit. That's the spirituality of wisdom, isn't it?
Yeah. But I want to give you an example I use in the book of just passivity as powerful generativity. And I got this story from a Hollywood writer, a woman, and she says she grew up in an alcoholic family, dysfunctional. Said, my father's alcoholism destroyed our family. 5 siblings. By the time my dad died, we couldn't be in a room with each other at the same city. Said, and then for 30 years, my mother tried to reconcile us, and she couldn't do it. Then my mother died of cancer, and during the last 3 days of her life, she was in hospice, unconscious. The family gathered around her, and they reconciled. She was able to do when she couldn't do anything. She was able to do what she couldn't do in all her activity. That's also true for Jesus, and that's also very important for our last years, when we're marginalized, when we're no longer in charge or in a wheelchair, and so on. We have the power. And I got this insight from Henry now. We have a power to give off some intangible that we can't give off in all our activity, you know.
I'm thinking about what you're saying, and I'm a big student of Martin Luther King, and he said over and over, and almost every speech he ever gave, unearned suffering love is redemptive.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about, having the wisdom and the maturity to move into unearned suffering love. And trust that God can do great things with us. Now, can I ask about all of this on a little more personal level?
Yeah.
Because you're an oblate, right? An oblate priest.
Yes.
They were the president of the Oblate School of Theology in San Antonio, Texas, where you've had me be there, and I just loved it. I'm amazed at your great leadership. I don't know any other theology school like it, but nobody's ever had you as the president. But you're older now, and you have serious health crises, and here you've had this amazing series of books, and now is the conclusion on the spirituality of wisdom. Tell us a little, however you wish, for you, how is that happening in your own personal life, and any concrete practical lessons or practices you have about choosing all of this wisdom as we go to the final years of our lives, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great question, John. Wisdom comes upon us in two ways. Sometimes we proactively choose it, and sometimes we learn it by conscription. So for instance, talking personally, okay, I've been for most of the years of my life in leadership, in charge, taking charge, and so on. And you don't want to step down as president. All of a sudden, you realize you're marginalized. Nobody's asking for your opinion. They're doing, and we're human. All of a sudden, like we're used to being in control. And so it's letting go of control, and it's difficult. You have to. I need prayer, and I need, because I'm still, writing and teaching and so on. So I'm not radically marginalized, but I'm marginalized the way I used to be, and so and as my health deteriorates, it's going to be more and more. And so I have to learn to let go, a little humor, that Christmas carol, let it snow, let it snow, let it snow. My mantra now is let it go, let it go.
That works. Yeah.
It's just a constant let go, let go, let go. And that question I asked before, who am I when I stop doing, and I still am doing enough that I don't have to face that. But someday, John, you and I will have to face that. Who are you when we stop doing? How do we have a self-image, and how do we, like now it says, well, you're God's beloved. That's true, but how do we actually own that?
It was so helpful what he said, that every human being on the planet and throughout history is the infinite beloved of God. And he said to just really claim that as your fundamental identity. And that was important for me early on in life and as a Jesuit novice. And then I realized Jesus is saying, the beloved sons and daughters of God, he calls them peacemakers in the Beatitudes. Blessed are, and that love your enemies, then you're really the beloved of God, the God of universal love. So it's a movement into that. And so much to talk about. Ron, I never got to ask a little of your story, and we don't have too much time, but can you tell us a little bit about joining the Oblates and becoming a priest and writing books and running a school of theology? And you've spoken all over the world for many decades.
Yeah. Well, John, a great line I once heard from Jim Mackey, the Irish theologian. He said, divine providence is the conspiracy of accidents to which God speaks. So in my life, there's been a wonderful conspiracy of accidents. But let me talk about, I grew up in a very, very sheltered, but very good, Roman Catholic family community. But, I was a very sheltered young man, To tell you, I went to novitiate at age 17. I'd never used a telephone. We didn't have running water, and so on. But one of the things, if somebody asks, what is the deepest moment in your life that marked you. It was when I was 13 years old, and a neighbor who I was very close to, a young man, committed suicide, hung himself in the barn. Nothing has ever scarred me like that, and I'm a priest today because of that. It was a mystical experience. It changed my life, you know. So I went to novitiate at 17, and I went there, like C.S. Lewis said, I was the most reluctant convert in the history of Christendom. I was the most reluctant novice. You know, I didn't want to be a priest. It's something I need to do this. But from day one, it was right. It was right. And then the Oblates, and I'm proud of our charism. You know, our charism is to serve the poor. You know, we were founded to reach out to the poor, and by and large, we do that. You know, if you go into England, Ireland, Scotland, Mexico, and so on, in the inner cities where the police are scared to go, you're going to find the Oblates. You know, but then you know, I was a good student, and then they sent me away for further studies with the idea that we had a newspaper like America. We were supposed to, right? But while I was there, a priest at the seminary left the priesthood, and the dean phoned me and said, "You have to come and teach for a year." Well, that launched my teaching career.
And there you were for the rest of your life, a teacher. But you had a natural talent for teaching, Ron.
Yeah, you know, from the first day I was in class, I said, "I'm home. I'm home. This is where I need to be."
Yeah.
You know, and then of course you get pushed into leadership for some years and so on, which at the beginning I kind of resisted. Thank God I didn't become a bishop, but you know, like at least with provincial and stuff, you step away at a certain point. But I've always kept my feet academically. I began writing, and I've never stopped.
You know that I've been spending a lot of my life, among other things, and even with this podcast, trying to teach the nonviolence of Jesus. So I just want to ask you any insights that you have, given your whole life and all your wisdom and teaching about Jesus, but particularly that he's nonviolent, because, you know, these days Christians are violent, racist, supporting fascism, yes, bomb the hell out of them, and on and on. Christians are the ones building nuclear weapons and managing fossil fuels and so forth. And so I think we need to, as Pope Leo's been saying, go back to the peacemaking Jesus and his lessons of nonviolence. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, John, thanks for bringing that up. I think that's the most needed message today. You know, we've lost that. You know, like right now, you look at the wars, right? We're trying to solve violence by violence. You know, one of my heroes, as you see this, Daniel Berrigan, and young Daniel Berrigan says, all violence begets more violence. You know, and that is so true. So I look at people like him and Dorothy Day and Gandhi and, you know, people like that who just say with violence, never, 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 never. You know, basically, violence begets violence. And so you look today, you know, it's awful, you know, and it's not just what we're losing, the sense of nonviolence, we're losing the Sermon on the Mount. You know, politicians are openly saying that compassion is a weakness. That remember somebody said to Jake Tapper said, "Wake up, Jake. The world runs by power, by dominance, and so on." So today, there's an ethos now that basically it's completely counter to the Sermon on the Mount, where they see meekness, you know, compassion, empathy as a weakness. You know, the world's run by power. We've never needed the message of nonviolence more than now. And notice in the world how many people are trying to solve violence by violence, you know, which, you know, it's never going to work.
Never going to work. And Jesus says, reject violence, literally offer no violent resistance to one who does evil. But he goes even farther by active universal love. Love not just your neighbor or one another, but your enemies.
The Sermon on the Mount is the greatest moral code ever written, you know, and it goes directly against violence. But also, part of it is not just violence, but, you know, for the one of the strongest motifs in both testaments of Scripture is to welcome the stranger, to welcome the stranger, to welcome the refugee. And today, there's universal against it, oftentimes in the name of Christianity. That's antithetical to Jesus, you know.
So that's why I've been inviting everyone to use this clumsy word of Gandhi and Dr. King and to figure out how can we all rise to the occasion, become more nonviolent to that holistic level of nonviolence of Gandhi, Dorothy Day, and Dr. King, and actually get serious and mature into the wisdom of nonviolence, especially in our elder years. And I'm so glad you said that you think that's the greatest need, because I always have thought that, but I sure do get challenged about that a lot, like how misguided I am, you know?
You know, John, a great line I heard from Raymond Brown, the great scripture scholar.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, when you're young and you're cosy, he said, you have placards, said, when you get to be 70 years old, said, park your placard in your closet and bring out a basement towel and start washing feet. I love that. He said, as you get older, he said, park your placard, bring out a basement towel and start washing people's feet,
I think we need to do both, actually, wash people's feet, but we need to keep marching. You told me how much you liked my friend and teacher, Daniel Berrigan. I wonder if you could say a word about him, because I haven't often heard great theologians or Christian writers like you praising Dan.
Well, through and through. First of all, this is not a spiritual thing. First of all, I envied him as a writer. That guy was a great writer.
He was like an Irish poet from the 19th century. He spoke a different language.
I thought, who writes like that? He was just a great writer. But his nonviolence, and also like some of his thoughts, and I think it's in your book, The Essential Writings, and so on, the speech he gives to the judge after he's been sentenced.
Yes.
That is a masterpiece of just, insight, humility, everything else, and honesty. And remember, the judge was just so moved, So
you're talking about 1990. Dan is about to be sentenced to 10 years in prison for the Plowshares trial. This was big news in the New York Times and all. And I put his testimony in that book. And I don't know if you remember it or have it, that what particularly moved you. What I thought he said, well, so the judge later said, I came in ready to throw the book at Berrigan's. Yeah. And Dan stood up and said, well, whatever you think is helpful. If you think it would be useful for me to be in prison, great. If you think it would be useful for me to be out serving the poor, great. But I read it later as he's not talking to the judge. He was talking to Jesus. I don't know if you saw that, Ron.
Yeah. Remember, he also said to the judge, he says, it's not easy. I hate going to prison. He said, I'd sooner be baptizing babies and doing regular stuff. He said, but the violence has to stop. Like he said, this is not what I want to be doing. I'd like to be, a priest, with baptizing babies and going out, He said, but I have to do this, and another great line I heard, when I was a young priest, and I thought, wow, so some journalist was interviewing him, and she said, Father Berrigan said, where does your faith lie? Is it in your head or in your heart? Berrigan said, spark on his face, says, ma'am, he said, faith is rarely where your head is at. It's even less rarely where your heart is at. Faith is where your ass is at. He said, and he meant to say, I'm not trying to be cute. He says, your head tells you what you think is wise. Your heart tells you what you'd like to do. There's a deeper part that tells you what you have to do to call, And that's also what he told the judge. I don't like going to prison. I don't like being in people's faces. I'd like to baptize babies and go to social. But, people are getting killed. I have to do something.
So he means you're sitting in, your rear end is blocking the entrance to the Pentagon, or you're sitting in jail, or you're sitting in court. And that was his entire way of life. I think he was probably arrested 250 times. It's hard to know because he was arrested pretty much once a month, whether people knew it or not. We're coming to the end, unfortunately, Ron, and this is ridiculous to say this, but here goes. I have a lot of nerve. Here we are, and after all you've done in your journey, we're witnessing the collapse of democracy, growing fascism, white supremacy, billions in poverty, and billionaires now running the country, basically, plus permanent warfare, the threat of nuclear weapons as great as ever, and climate chaos bearing down on us, and so many Christians and Catholics supporting all these forms of violence and death and destruction. What message do you have in general to our listeners, to Christians, in response to these crises?
Well, like Berrigan, be the one who stands up, and also live in hope. Don't give up hope. And part of hope, I love this from Marilyn Robinson, who teaches in one of our programs, says, keep a subversive sense of humor. Keep a subversive sense of humor. But, I agree with you, John. In my lifetime, I've never lived through darker days, because I didn't live through the Second World War or something. But we somehow have to keep our hope up, and we somehow have to, like Dorothy Day, the violence stops with me. This stops with me. We have to be the one who stands up. And but these are dark days, and one of our practical struggles, John, is I've lived with priests who he said, where do you unload your tension? Like basically, we need to carry this tension, but how do you unload it? Where do you get rid of it?
Well, that would I would be asking you, what sustains you through these days? In other words, how are you unloading your tension? Where do you find your energy and strength? I presume meditation and prayer.
Partly in community with others who feel the same,
Mm-hmm.
And somebody just told me, he says, I watched and he said, I wish to God there were more swear words in the vocabulary. He said there aren't enough cuss words in the vocabulary to cover this, but to keep that kind of wit and humor and just maintain your sanity, That was another one of Berrigan's things. He says, maybe you can't save the world, but you can save your own sanity,
That's great. Well, do you have any last word of encouragement for our listeners as we wrap it up?
Well, live in hope, the resurrection, dead bodies rise. I was going to tell you, if I have a minute, that we have a Chinese student here from Hong Kong, a Baptist, who's in our PhD program, and I've got him completely besuited by Berrigan, and he wants to do it on justice, on Daniel Berrigan, but he's scared to do it because, he's still living in communist China. He said, they'll persecute my family, but just to know that he's completely taken with Daniel Berrigan. He's read everything Berrigan's read, and so on. So,
well, that's great. Dan would love to hear that. And Dan said famously, if you want to follow Jesus, you better look good on wood. Yep. So there you go, Ron.
That. Hey, I love that expression.
Thank you so much for speaking with me, Ron Rolheiser, today on this episode of the Nonviolent Jesus podcast.
John, and thank you for the work you do. You're one of my inspirations. You're one of the Berrigan, Dorothy Day. You put your feet there. You're Buddhist. You went to prison. And so keep on doing this.
Well, thank you. So, friends, you can hear many other podcasts and find other upcoming Zoom programs at beatitudecenter.org, and where you can also sign up to receive our free e-blast with news about other upcoming podcasts and Zooms. Please tell your friends and coworkers and church folk about the podcast. Hope you'll all get my new book, Universal Love, Surrendering to the God of Peace. You can check me out also at www.johndeere.org and on Substack at Father John Deere. May the God of peace bless you all. Keep on following the nonviolent Jesus and standing up and speaking out and resisting war, greed, racism, fascism, and injustice, and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. God bless you. See you next time.